So today's presentation, it's on the award-winning Agnes Greenway project in the City of New Westminster. Urban Systems worked with the city to design and implement the Agnes Greenway as an interim active transportation facility during the pandemic. It was installed in December of 2020 prior to public engagement to allow informed feedback to shape the ultimate design. Our presenter today is Brent McMurtry, who is a transportation engineer at Urban Systems. He's passionate about working with communities to help plan and build safe, comfortable, and attractive streets to encourage all folks to use active transportation. In communities across Canada, in particular in Metro Vancouver, Brent is actively involved in the planning and designing of multimodal transportation plans, as well as corridor plans. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to input them at the top right-hand corner where there's a chat icon. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I'll welcome Brent McMurtry.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jill, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. Yeah, nice to hear too that in-person meetings are hopefully coming back soon. It's been a long time since I've been at a GVITE meeting, and yeah, none throughout the pandemic. So happy to be here presenting today, and hopefully look forward to any questions and kind of discussion around this Agnes Greenway. And just want to hopefully not too many people or no one has seen a sort of similar presentation before, kind of building off a presentation that I gave with Mike Anderson at the TAC conference in the fall. And yeah, but with that, just a quick outline and a nice picture here from the Agnes Greenway, the interim facility that's there. A little bit about myself and why I think active transportation is an important piece in building sustainable cities moving forward. And then a little bit of a deeper dive into the Agnes Greenway and what that rapid implementation has allowed us to do as far as public engagement and learning to hopefully get a really great facility, which will be constructed later this year. And then some time for some questions. So a quick slide here showing my interest in riding bikes and kind of a full spectrum from when you can see me as a little guy on the back of a tandem bike when I was a kid. I grew up in Calgary and always have been riding bikes with my family. So something that this is a picture in the Maritimes. We went and did a 3-week-long kind of bike touring trip. I think I was 5 years old, and we're camping in between each of our rides. And then kind of moving into the middle, I lived in Vancouver until June of 2021 and would bike to and from work, and really enjoyed seeing and experiencing the city from the great facilities that are available in Vancouver, and really a great way to inform the work that I do and helping other communities kind of improve their infrastructure. And then the photo on the right is me with the newest addition to my family, my young daughter, and kind of getting her excited about hopefully building more safe communities. So I now live in Squamish, and but still working with Urban from the Vancouver office. And then a little bit more about me at the bottom. So before my career as a transportation engineer, I was a cross-country skier and have a connection to the region through that as well. We raced the Olympics here in 2010. Went to school at University of Victoria after that, and have now ended up at Urban Systems, and really excited to yeah, work with lots of municipalities throughout Metro Vancouver and kind of across Western Canada. So I don't know if my little GIF here will play. Why active transportation? So I think like ultimately us as transportation professionals, it's about moving people, and there's really only two things that we have, and that is space and how we use it. And I think that's a really effective visualization from NACDO that just kind of shows how we choose and the amount of space that we dedicate to different modes is really plays a huge role in how accessible and connected our communities are. So recognizing that a single travel lane can only move maybe up to 1,600 people an hour in single occupancy vehicles, whereas bike lanes, sidewalks, and transit can move significantly more at the same amount of space. So when we're working with limited space, it's important to make the most of it and think about what we can do to bring our communities together and allow, healthy and active communities to make sense. So the next piece, active transportation is good for the environment, great for the environment. A lot of the emissions throughout North America and really around the world are related to transportation, and they don't need to be an area where greenhouse gases are going to continue to be a huge challenge with the climate emergency that we're facing in around the world. I think there's a lot of excitement around the electrification and the move towards autonomous vehicles, but I really think that scaling back and thinking about the simplest mode to connect cities and connect people is really a more prudent approach and something that will be more successful in the long run. And then building on that, also highlighting that many trips are quite short. So even though I can speak for myself, I live in Squamish and I drive a car down into the city, into Vancouver for work relatively often, but still many of the trips that I'm making throughout a week are short, kind of trips to the grocery store, trips to visit friends, and those are trips that are often best captured for me and most enjoyably captured walking and rolling. And then this is just kind of building off some research that Kate Hosford's done, and I think thinking past sort of the big ideas and why it's important to build these all ages and abilities cycling corridors, and how the graphic on the right here showing as the City of Vancouver is continuing to expand their cycling network and their all ages and abilities network with local street bikeways and protected bike lanes, the mode share of how people get around has correspondingly grown, and you can see locations where there's more density of all ages and abilities cycling facilities lead to higher cycling commute shares. So just an important connection to think that this infrastructure is really important, and as we'll kind of get into through the presentation about the Agnes Greenway, that networks are really important as well. So with that background, I'll jump right into the rapid implementation and the Agnes Greenway. So showing a picture here and kind of running through the outline for the second part of the presentation, a little bit about the corridor itself and the project, setting the stage. So some of the policy work that had been completed by the City of New West and work that Urban Systems, we worked with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities sort of in response to the pandemic and kind of responding to what people and cities were seeing. And highlighting some of the key elements that we found were critical for making the Agnes Greenway a success and that can be useful when we expand past this and think about rapid implementation for other corridors. Some of the engagement, activation, and monitoring that we completed after the corridor had been installed, and then kind of what our process has been to get to the permanent design, which is, I think, closing. The tender is closing tomorrow, I think, or sometime in the next couple of days. So going to be constructed shortly. And then finally, some lessons learned that both us and the city have kind of learned and hopefully can apply to some future projects. So a little bit about the Agnes Greenway, and the corridor itself is relatively short. It's connecting Douglas College to Dufferin Street in New Westminster, and this is kind of in just north of the downtown core of New Westminster. One of the, everyone who knows New West, it's a pretty hilly municipality, and so this is a nice flat connection that connects Douglas College. There's the GVITE Elementary School, and we'll connect to the future active transportation overpass of Highway 99 here. So when the Patella Bridge replacement project is completed, this corridor will tie directly into the planned overpass, and will provide access to New Westminster to the east of this corridor. And then looking into future phases, I think that the goal is to continue to improve connection to New West Station, which is on Columbia and 8th. And so the green line in this map is showing, and then a future connection down to the waterfront as well. So it's another quayside where there's continuing to be growth and some new development that is going to provide some future access. So a little bit about the timeline and kind of where we came from. The approach that we took for this project, sort of building off of the city's direction, was we worked with them to develop a interim design using low-cost materials that could be installed quickly, and that was designed and installed in the fall and winter of 2020. That allowed us to observe how it was being used and collect feedback through public engagement and stakeholder engagement through the winter and spring of 2021. And then building off of that engagement, it allowed us to make some modifications to the interim facility, but ultimately this is all being done working towards the permanent greenway, which hopefully will be installed here summer of 2022, and will really be an amazing complete kind of street that has a lot of different elements, which will make it a really dynamic space, but kind of a cool process as well to go through this and learn from some of the findings of the interim design and hopefully allow that to make this ultimate design even better. And then future here, phase 2, as I was noting, a connection to the New West SkyTrain station and the Fraser River Esplanade. So those future connections will be looked at some future time. And then a little bit of the background kind of policy pieces that led to this. So as we all know, and the reason why we're doing this virtually, the COVID-19 pandemic has really had a pretty significant impact on our cities and our lives. And with that, the City of New Westminster was one of many cities kind of throughout the world that responded to create some additional space for people and used started a program called Streets for People 2020, which temporarily reallocated space and created additional locations for people to walk and bike and be able to physically distance and to stay safe, especially during the early days of the pandemic when there was a lot of new and unknown things going on. Another kind of policy piece is, and I have a little bit more information on the coming slides, is there was not a lot of guidance, and so a lot of cities were kind of scrambling to figure out what was the best approach to reallocate this space and what kind of tools existed. So we worked with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to put together a guide called the COVID-19 Street Rebalancing Guide that looked at a bunch of different case studies and then provided some high-level design guidance on different tools that could be used to adapt the existing streetscape into something that is a little bit safer and more comfortable for people during the pandemic. So here, highlighting some photos, and this is some of the Streets for People work that the City of New West completed. So they rapidly reallocated road space early in the pandemic, and like I noted, to encourage physically distancing and to encourage people to get outside and be active when there's a lot of other things that were not possible. The city collected feedback and completed a bunch of intercept surveys, public life studies, and completed some public engagement as well, just to understand how these changes were, I guess, how they were being perceived by community members and whether or not they were things that were going to continue to be a priority in areas that the city should continue to pursue. So just highlighting some of the different changes they made, this street reallocation, creating some temporary sort of street patios on 6th Street. I think this is another sort of lane reallocation, so taking a travel lane and dedicating that to people walking and biking, and then just different public engagement, so looking at different ways to make it interactive and connecting with community members to see how they like the changes. And that led to the Mayor and Council making a commitment to reallocating permanently 10% of all road space in the City of New West. So I think some of the findings from this pandemic-led changes will really help shape the city moving forward and recognize that space for people is a critical thing to bring the community together. So then this is just an overview or a couple of screen grabs from the street rebalancing guide that we created with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and allowed practitioners and people in the community to kind of figure out what different tools exist and maybe what makes sense for different locations. So the intent of the guide was to be not a super technical guide. It's really more of a toolbox that shows what is possible and kind of helps communities learn from what others have done. So something that helped inform the work that we completed with the City of New West on the Agnes Greenway itself. So with that, this is just a slide kind of highlighting the changes that we saw for the City of New West and the Agnes Greenway, and moving from a shared street to something that accommodates a dedicated, physically separated, protected bike lane on the left here, while still maintaining accessibility to the transit stop for transit users. So with that, I'll jump into kind of some of the key elements of rapid implementation, and also a little bit of background on the corridor itself. So this corridor is primarily a residential corridor with multifamily buildings along the corridor, and parking on both sides of the street in the precondition of this rapid implementation. And in order to accommodate this two-way cycling facility, the city and urban systems worked together to assess kind of what different options existed. There had been it's a corridor that's been identified in a number of different plans, transportation master plan, downtown transportation plan, and the facilities that had been identified were these two-way protected bike lanes, and to allow that to occur, 2 blocks of the corridor were switched from being two-way traffic to one-way traffic. Excuse me, allowing on-street parking to be maintained on both sides of the street. And then for blocks that are a little bit further from the commercial core of New West, which is kind of on 6th Street at the west end of this corridor, 1 lane of parking was reallocated once we were east of Maryville Street. And that was kind of the different trade-offs along different sections of the corridor. One other design change was from what was originally identified was the downtown transportation master plan had identified converging one-way streets that would converge at 4th Street or diverge from 4th Street, and the design, our team kind of made a decision to change that to only one-way travel in the westbound direction. So to implement it itself, we kind of looked at some of the key components that were necessary, or key components that helped this project be successful, and broke them into 4 simple categories. So we want the implementation to be fast, to be flexible, to be cheap, and to be accessible. And I'll jump into a little bit more information on each of these in the next few slides. So the first element here of being fast. So one of the challenges often with infrastructure projects is the duration of construction, and the impacts to the community that are felt through that construction time can be pretty significant. And with rapid implementation, sort of right there in the name, one of the main benefits of it is the ability to make changes quite quickly, that community members are maybe, aren't impacted as adversely, and are able to kind of see what the changes are going to look like right away. And so these 2 photos here are kind of showing the day when the majority of the infrastructure was installed. I think pavement markings had been installed about a week before, and this was a nice day in December 2020. And so this photo on the left is kind of first thing in the morning around 8 a.m. And then the photo on the right, when the last concrete barriers were being installed, was kind of the end of the day. I think it was around 6 o'clock, and maybe even a little bit earlier. And so just sort of showing that the vast majority of the infrastructure was installed over just a handful of days. Signage came a little bit later, and then there was a rapid flashing beacon, which was installed, I think, in the next couple of days. But overall, the project was fully implemented within a couple of weeks and able to be used by community members and sort of start the transition for community members to learn what those changes are and how to use the street again. And so kind of building on that and using these lighter weight materials, a key for this project, and I think for many rapid implementation projects, is having flexibility to make changes. So by using lower cost materials and materials that are not fixed in the asphalt, at least initially, especially, it allowed us as a design team to adapt and make some modifications as needed. And so it's something that I think also will make the permanent design better, as we have a bit of a stronger understanding of what some of the challenges and concerns from this rapid implementation version of the project are. And I'm really excited to see the ultimate design, and when it's in the ground, how we've kind of been able to learn where some of those challenge and sticky points are and adapted to those. So the next piece of this is cheap, and this is something that I think, it's important to recognize. Anyone who's works in this world knows that capital infrastructure is very expensive, and it doesn't always, the existing capital budgets don't always allow sort of the expansion of a network as rapidly as we would desire. And so I think by using relatively cheap materials, it made the procurement quite a bit easier, and it's something that city crews were largely responsible for installing many of these, or supporting the installation of many of these different treatments, and sort of worked with independent contractors and installers instead of hiring a general contractor to lead the construction. It also meant that we were sort of making the most of the environment that we had. And so you can see this photo on the right here is showing a transition that, wouldn't really pass the design recommendations of most design guidance, but for an interim facility, something that we as a design team felt was an option that worked okay to create a facility and protection separated from sort of motor vehicles that worked good enough, recognizing that we're not always going to have the perfect solution, but something that we can learn from. And this is actually an area in front of the elementary school, GVITE Elementary School, and an area where we heard from community members and have made some changes for significant changes in our ultimate design that will make this intersection a lot more comfortable for all users. But in this existing condition, we had to kind of work with what we had, and that meant using curb extensions as a kind of a shared crossing location for people biking and people walking. And then accessibility. So I think one of the things that was really important to the city and really important to us was to ensure that accessibility wasn't sort of forgotten just because we were doing this as kind of a rapid implementation, sort of semi-permanent design. Didn't mean that we were going to not think about what we could do to make it accessible for all users. And so we kind of built off of what the City of Vancouver was using for temporary bus islands or bus bays along Robson Street, and kind of adapted that to our context here on the Agnes corridor to create a kind of pseudo floating bus stop where we provided a level boarding and a lighting space for people who are taking transit, but that it's shared with cyclists. And then to improve sort of understanding of the expectation with this is a bus stop that doesn't have really high boardings and lightings, but even so, we provided some sort of informational signage at the bus stop to help users understand what those interactions are supposed to look like and kind of the design intent as they are using the facility. So I think that a combination of ensuring that the design is done in a way that accessibility is forefront and a major consideration, but then kind of working past that to ensure that there's some sort of communication tool that helps people feel comfortable and safe and know what the changes mean and how they're going to interact with those changes. So those were kind of the four main keys to successful rapid implementation: to have it fast, cheap, accessible, and flexible. And so with that, we were able to get this corridor installed quite quickly and able to hear from community members how it was working and what changes we needed to consider as we're moving to this permanent design. So that brings me on to the next slide here, and the approach that we took for engagement, some activations and monitoring. As I kind of noted, the Greenway itself was installed quite quickly and was installed in advance of doing project-specific public engagement. So the previous downtown transportation plan and the transportation master plan had completed engagement, but not specific to this corridor. And so the first time that community members and stakeholders were able to, or I guess community members, I think we did do some targeted stakeholder engagement in advance of the installation, but was the first time that we were able to sort of hold broader engagement was after the interim facility was in the ground. And that allowed, sort of the lived experience and feedback of whether or not, it was working, what concerns, considerations we had. So we had 2 different online surveys, a bunch of different stakeholder meetings with the school community, with there's a strong cycling, the hub has a local arm, there's a walkers caucus in New West as well. So getting a variety of different users, user groups to provide feedback on how the facility was working. And it was also great. This is the first project in quite a while that we were doing in-person public engagement. So I think this is summer of last year where we had a couple of different pop-up locations that we were able to come out and talk to community members and figure out what their thoughts and concerns were and help us advance our permanent design. And activation, so it's something that's neat and kind of building off the location of the corridor and really having the GVITE Elementary School being kind of the backbone or a real key destination along the corridor with a great park and playground, as well as just sort of the school and daycare that are at that site as well. Is we worked with the community and we worked with Happy City to activate the Greenway. So added some planters with benches and really cool to see. I was out there actually last week and to see still people are out, kind of community members and connecting with different people sitting on these benches. Every time I've been out there since they've been installed, there's people that are using the space and just kind of reclaiming some of this road for people, which I think is great. And another thing that Happy City led was they worked with a local artist to kind of do a paint by numbers type thing on some of these barriers. You know, the low cost kind of rapid implementation approach sometimes leads to infrastructure that's not the most people oriented or really attractive for the street. And so it's definitely a nice touch to engage and a great way to connect with different community members. So there was kids and families that were out helping paint these barriers in front of the school. Another activation was rain activated paint. So during the online engagement, just different ways to let people know what was going on and sort of the changes that were happening. So Happy City used stencils and and installed some rain-activated paint that kind of informed people to check out the City of New West's engagement website. And then the last was there's a daycare just across the street from GVITE Elementary School, and little decorations, so things to soften some infrastructure that can otherwise not be that people oriented, and make it a little bit more interesting. And then monitoring. So another key part of our design process was to ensure that we were capturing before and after data on how people are using the corridor. So looking at parking occupancy, traffic volumes, and also looking at speeds. And something kind of unique about the corridors, there's laneways both north and south of the corridor that run most of the length of the corridor. And so we were not only looking at the impacts on Agnes Street itself, because with some one-way street modifications, we were also wanting to see what the impacts were on the laneways on either side. And then parking occupancy, with a relatively significant amount of parking removed for this project or reallocated for this project. We just wanted to get an understanding of what the impacts were along the corridor and a little bit in the broader community as well. So one of the findings from this traffic and speed study was that travel speeds and travel volumes in the laneways went up a little bit. And so one of the mitigation measures for the ultimate design is to add some traffic calming through those laneways to hopefully reduce travel speeds at a minimum, and hopefully reduce some of the volumes as well. And in another area where we ended up spending quite a bit of time was transit routing. So as you can see from the floating bus stop there, that there's transit routes. So there's two different transit routes that before the Agnes Greenway were installed would travel both east and west on the Agnes Greenway. So you see that in our pre-routing here, Route 103 and Route 105. And those are both connecting to the New West SkyTrain station on Columbia Street and 8th. And so with the changes being proposed and the one-way street conversions, these routes needed to be changed. And also recognizing that there's pretty significant grades down to the Fraser, that as we work through some of the different routing options, we kind of learned about some of the challenges that each of those routing options would present, and how people are using these routes. And there is a significant number of users who are not as mobile as others, and so these changes, even though you look at it on plan, it's only a block, but can actually be fairly significant when you think of the grades and how users of this route are kind of using it as a primary transit source. And so we worked through a lot of different options, and we're really thankful to have Coast Mountain Bus working collaboratively with us and kind of thinking through what the different options are and what the impacts for each of those changes would be. They actually landed with a final routing for the interim design, which I see at the bottom here after kind of iterating through a few different versions. And this final routing actually required a change on Royal and Maryville, where a closure. So there's a access lane for eastbound traffic traveling on Royal. Previously, before, I guess, used to be blocked from turning right onto Maryville, but that has been opened up again to allow buses as well as other vehicles to come down Maryville and then turn to head east on Agnes. And actually the Route 103, which in our interim design is not using the same routing, is not traveling up to Royal, but is instead using Carnarvon, which is one block to the south. But for our ultimate design and kind of to make the corner geometry work the way that we wanted it to work at Elliott and Agnes, the routing of the 103 is now going to match that of the Route 105. So just kind of, I guess, building off some of those key elements to a successful rapid implementation is is the ability to respond to concerns from community members. And so I think that sort of recognizing the fast there, that working with Coast Mountain was really a good way to, they're comfortable and able to go out and test terms with the infrastructure that had been installed to ensure that the changes that we were making were safe and comfortable for their drivers. And then also the flexibility to respond to those concerns and find changes that ensured people are able to access where they need to go. And I think accessibility piece, we were thinking about bus stop design, but I think routing design also has a big component in accessibility, and recognizing the grades in New West play a pretty significant role in how people are able to travel. And so by creating a route that allows access to stops that are kind of at that same plane, I think for the users of Agnes who are comfortable and used to traveling on these routes was something that we were happy we were able to achieve at the end. So with that, kind of the transition past our interim design, which you see on the left here, to what the ultimate design will look like here on the right. We used some renderings like this along the corridor for our public engagement as well to help people kind of visualize what the street may look and feel like in the future. And so we're, as I mentioned at the start here, our tender is closing, I think any day, and this will be constructed in the coming months, which is really exciting to kind of see what it's going to look like. So our what started as a pretty small design team and team at the city really expanded to take advantage of the multidisciplinary skills I'm lucky to work with at Urban Systems. And so our team grew, and we kind of used skill sets from green infrastructure, landscape architecture, and kind of some of the other design components, our transportation and civil design, to create a design that works for the City of New West. And so a handful of faces on here from the City of New West as well, but just a fun process to be a part of and kind of take the learnings from the interim design and really apply them to create what will, I'm sure, and I'm excited to see, be a really exciting project once it is finally constructed, coming soon. And so with that, some of the key improvements from the interim design to the permanent design. So one of them here I'm showing is there's a new closure that we're closing Blackwood, which is a small kind of half block street, and that is something that, based off sort of sightlines and network connections, decided and worked with the city to identify it as an opportunity, and we were able to engage community members on that during our public engagement. And so this is going to be a cool space where there's going to be a new like a dog park and kind of little micro park with some seating areas as well as some green infrastructure. The modified transit rerouting, kind of, as I mentioned, changes based off the feedback that we heard and the design for the intersections. Traffic calming, so yeah, once again mentioned that the laneways on either side are going to have traffic calming features to reduce travel speeds and hopefully reduce traffic volumes as well. Enhanced accessibility, so there's, with the ultimate design, there's going to be 2 new raised intersections as well as raised crosswalk and a handful of curb extensions along the corridor. Green infrastructure, so yeah, we were working with the city's drainage team to find opportunities for green infrastructure, and then working with their parks and landscape team to kind of integrate urban design treatments and placemaking into those green infrastructure and public spaces. And then also enhancing the tree canopy. So where possible along the corridor, we're adding a bunch of new trees, and we'll create a space that is, yeah, really nice and people oriented, which is great. And so final slide here, lessons learned. You can see I forgot to change the landscape out that I took here of that closure at Blackwood. But anyways, some of the lessons learned, and I think I saw a couple of questions pop up here that are maybe on some of these topics, but So communication through multiple channels. So one of the things that we heard when the rapid implementation occurred was that some people hadn't been informed or didn't know about the project. And we did send a mail out to all of the houses or all of the properties along the corridor, but it happened relatively soon or relatively close to when the actual changes took place. And so that was something that some community members felt they would have appreciated some additional communication and different ways to be reached. Yeah, be prepared to make mistakes. One of the nice things about these flexible designs is that if you make a mistake and you're able to address it by making a change, it's a little bit significantly easier than with hard infrastructure that is installed into the ground. Perfect can't be the enemy of the good. I think that was one of the things along the corridor, and especially for this interim design, recognizing that future changes are going to happen quite soon in the case of this corridor, and that making some of the more significant changes right away probably isn't worthwhile. So it was important to kind of recognize where, some flexibility in our design parameters was required to make a facility that ultimately provides that connection, but maybe isn't as separated from the pedestrians as we would have liked. Yeah, we've learned that there's a lot of calls and emails, especially shortly after the changes were made, and so people often resist those changes. This had fairly significant traffic flow and network impacts that we heard some concerns about, but ultimately after the first couple of weeks or first month, that there hasn't been significant or challenges and concerns, and so people are pretty adaptable, and ultimately if there's a change made, they will figure out a new way that works, and pretty soon not remember the way it was before. So if you can kind of get past those initial concerns, people are pretty amazing at figuring out a way that works for them and some other way to change themselves. Unforeseen challenges will arise, and so I think that with the transit routing piece, there was quite a bit of thought that was done initially into what the best rerouting option would be, and hearing specific concerns from residents and transit riders was something that I don't think we were anticipating would take as much energy and as many iterations as it did. But that's part of making these changes, is that there will be things you need to respond to, and that's okay. And then one last piece is kind of building off the network slide that I showed at the beginning. Is one corridor really doesn't build a network, and it's something that we've heard from the engagement that we've done, and even from the counts that we've completed, is that there hasn't been a huge increase in cycling traffic. I think that a lot of the feedback that we've heard is the corridor is a lot more comfortable for people walking, and is a nicer street, but it doesn't have a lot of cyclists yet. And I think that until the future connections and the new Patello Bridge and that overpass are built, that the network is a really critical component. And I think that's one of the great things about rapid implementation, is it really allows those capital dollars to be spread a little bit further and create more corridors that ultimately do a very good job without maybe being perfect. So those are some of the lessons learned, and that is it. So I think there's a couple of questions. I don't know, Jal, if it's a typical question format or.
Yeah, so we have some time to answer some questions. Thank you, Brent, for a great presentation. It's nice to see on a local level that our spaces and our active transportation networks are being revitalized for the good, to be accessible for everyone. So I'll just go through, we have 3 questions so far. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, the top right-hand corner of your screen. So we'll start off with Colin's questions. Were there safety concerns about having a 2-way bike lane one side of the street, example, motorists turning from driveways or side streets, or passengers getting on off buses. Wouldn't be expecting cyclists to be approaching from one side.
Yeah, so and I think that it's like anything. There's always trade-offs and there's always considerations. The sort of agreed upon best practice is definitely to have unidirectional bike lanes on both sides. But especially for a rapid implementation project, the impacts in order to do that wouldn't have allowed for this project to move forward, and even for the ultimate project, that the impacts would have been pretty significant. Many of the buildings along the corridor don't have, they're older, kind of 3-4 story walk-ups and don't have parkades. And so the on-street parking is something that is really well utilized and something that is important to be maintained, at least to a certain level. And so I think that what we tried to do as far as design mitigations is use signage and kind of consistent design cues along the corridor, having conflict paint at intersections, and then signage kind of identifying to yield to cyclists, as well as signage for folks who are turning out of driveways. So we haven't heard, there's been other sort of concerns that have been raised through the engagement that we've completed, but the two-way cycling facility on a two-way street hasn't been a raised concern. And also another consideration, that the corridor itself is a relatively low volume corridor, and then the sections that are two-way are kind of outside of the core couple of blocks of the corridor as well. So it's all about balancing trade-offs, and I think that this was where we landed, and ultimately it's been working well.
Thanks. The next question Colin asked is, are there any traffic signals along the corridor? This can make implementation on a two-way bike lane expensive and slow. Need to install new signal heads for the wrong way cyclists. That's the first question.
Yeah, so there is no traffic signals. There is one existing RFB crossing at 4th Street. And then through our design, we added an RFB at 6th Street with signage kind of like identifying to both cyclists and pedestrians to use the RFB. So yeah, definitely additional considerations when you have a two-way cycling facility on a corridor with traffic signals. Luckily, we didn't have that that consideration here. So yeah. It wasn't a concern for us.
Nice. The second part of the question is, can you comment quickly on getting cyclists into and out of the lane at each end and at intermediate intersections?
Yeah, so the context, once again, the intermediate intersections other than 6th Street are relatively local, kind of like downtown local streets, and so traffic volumes and facility types are just a shared street environment. The east end of the corridor, there's a local street bikeway that connects up north into sort of north of the corridor, north of Royal Ave, and then there's also a connection down to the Rotary Crosstown Greenway, to the Central Valley Greenway. And so at that location, we've added some additional pavement markings and have wayfinding signage to direct people to and from those locations, but the volumes are not such that there's additional measures required. And then the transitions at either end, so at the east end of the corridor, where the future Patello Bridge is, it transitions to a local street bikeway at that block where, we have a local street bikeway heading north, and where we have a local bike street heading south to the Central Valley Greenway. And then at the west end of the corridor, that was a challenging, there's kind of a connection that was not able to be included in the project due to some concerns brought forward by the provincial courthouse. And so something that we don't currently have a terminus other than Douglas College. So there is a connection, and it ramps up onto the sidewalk at Douglas College, kind of providing access into the college itself. I think that the city still is exploring opportunities for another connection to head south of Agnes, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. So sort of something still in the works.
And the last question that we have on the chat is from Kristen. Was there any opposition or approval challenges with respect to implementing this project quickly versus the traditional way?
Yeah, and I think that there was some pushback and some challenges. I think, you know, building off the lesson learned of, you know, it would have been better to communicate a little bit more broadly and use more than one communication tool for that initial kind of informed communication. Yeah, and I don't know, as far as I think like a process piece, there was challenges with trying to get this installed before the winter months arrived, and kind of the constraints with trying to install new pavement markings throughout our often wet and cold winters. But and then another thing, we were waiting on kind of confirmation from a council committee to kind of give direction that we were okay to proceed with this. So there were some challenging pieces from a timeline perspective. I think that something that maybe could have been done is we installed signage along the corridor, and maybe that could have been done a little bit more in advance. But largely the sort of pushback or concerns, kind of the comment around people are adaptable and sort of recognize that they can make some changes to their own habits, and that was something that I think most people adapted to fairly quickly. So not super significant opposition.
Great. I think that's all for questions for now. This presentation is recorded and will be available on YouTube shortly on the CITE YouTube page. So thank you, Brent, for the presentation. For any questions, feel free to email me at vancouver@cite7.org, and we can get in touch with you with Brent if you have any further questions on this project. So everyone, have a great rest of your day and take care and stay safe.